dirty though.
Okay,
everybody, are we ready
Tam, you're doing
to...
a fantastic job, Tam. Just a little bit of praise for a hard-working person.
Are we ready to
On an
start
occasional basis.
again? I think we are. Awesome. It's on here. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. More bits of paper.
Thanks, Tam.
We're now on item 12, and this is our draft facilities partnership policy. And Rebecca's there.
New shoes.
I've done mine.
Are we all?
Oh.
Are we all back? Yes, we are. Okay, over to you guys.
Good afternoon, committee members. I thought I'd just introduce who we are, in case some of you don't know who we are. So my name's Liz Civil, I'm the Manager of Community Policy, and with me is Rebecca Foreman in my team. So we're going to be talking to you today about the Facility Partnerships Policy, and as this is Rebecca's great work, I'm going to hand over to her to do that for you.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon is a better start, Madam Chair, Mr Mayor, councillors and members of the Independent Māori Statutory Board. Thank you for your time today. I'm aware you have a very busy agenda, so I'm going to give a very brief summary of this item. I only have 3 slides to leave as much time as possible for any questions that you might have. Today we're here seeking your endorsement to take a draft facility partnerships policy out for community consultation and formal engagement with local boards. As many of you will know, facility partnerships are where the council co-invests in community, arts and sports facilities alongside community partners and other funders. Facility partnerships can provide a way to increase both the number and range of facilities available in our diverse and fast-growing region over a shorter time frame than we could achieve by ourselves. Done well, they can enable us to stretch our facilities budgets and assets further by investing alongside others, and done well, they can help us to empower our communities where communities want to play an active role in developing and running their own facilities. Around 300 facilities in Auckland have been established through some form of partnership over the last 2 decades, and there are more in the pipeline. But since amalgamation, there's been no consistent regional policy in place to guide their selection and management. So I just want to start by giving you a very quick refresher of where this policy fits into our wider framework of strategies, policies and plans. If I could just go back 1 slide, please. Thank you. So this slide shows a simplified version of the diagram provided in the policy on page 8. The key thing really to notice is that the Facility Partnerships Policy appears in the final slice, the green one at the right. It is one of a family of enabling policies that support the work of our communities, along with the Community Occupancies or Leases Policy and the Community Grants Policy. Facility partnerships are a mechanism to deliver on the vision for Auckland, but setting this vision starts in the yellow slice right back at the very left with the Auckland Plan and local board plans. The blue slices name some of the strategies and plans that describe the specific outcomes we want, our role in delivering them, and our investment priorities. They include plans for particular sectors, populations, activities, and places. For example, the Sport and Recreation Strategic Action Plan describes why sport and recreation is important for Auckland, our role in delivering sport and recreation outcomes, and what we want to focus on. While the Sports Facilities Investment Plan that you've heard a bit about this morning will help us prioritise where and when we will invest in sports facilities to address unmet community needs and cater for growth. We allocate funding to deliver these outcomes and priorities through the long-term plan and the annual plan. For example, in recent weeks, you've allocated an additional $120 million over 10 years for sports and recreation facilities in the draft long-term plan. So the Facility Partnerships Policy kicks in once we have determined the outcomes we're looking for and the Council's role in that, where the priorities are, what the delivery model should be, and how much we will invest. It's a specific way of giving effect to that intent, in this case by supporting the community to work alongside us to deliver facilities. So I'll now talk very briefly about the draft policy approach we put before you today and how we arrived here. If I could have the next slide, thanks. So we came to this committee in February last year to share our learnings from looking closely at some of our existing facility partnerships. For example, we found that often decisions have been made on an ad hoc basis. We haven't looked closely enough at how the facility fits in the wider network or the evidence that it will meet needs. Often we haven't fully considered the lifetime costs of a partnership, and some facilities haven't actually been viable without ongoing support from council that hasn't been budgeted for. With many staff playing a role across the council family, we heard we haven't always been coordinated in our dealings with partners and our advice to elected members. Many partners told us they hadn't realised the enormity of what they were taking on and don't always feel well supported by us. Sometimes they can't even work out who to call. We also noticed that the council had very few facility partnerships with Māori. We wanted to know what we needed in the policy to ensure that Māori could partner with us in this way if they chose. You'll have seen in your papers also alongside the policy a findings report from some additional engagement we did in the second half of last year to explore facility partnerships with Māori specifically and what we might need to do differently in this space. Although we found Marae play a more significant role for Māori than other community facilities, we heard many similar things from our conversations with Māori. They also emphasised the importance of a shared purpose, enduring relationships, and investing in places where people already are. The new policy approach has been designed to respond to what we learned through all of that discovery and engagement work. I only have time to pick out a few things in this introduction. And I do want to acknowledge that there is a lot of detail in this document. This is because building and running facilities is complicated and often technical work, and we've learned that partnering effectively is complex work too. During our discovery work, many people told us that they want more detailed guidance to ensure that all of the right things are considered before making these kinds of commitments. However, we have done our best with the design to make it as easy as possible for people to find their way through and focus on what's important. One of the other reasons it's lengthy is that no two partnerships are the same. Some of our partnerships will be major investments involving other major stakeholders and funders. They'll cost millions of dollars and develop significant new buildings on public land, which will be part of our network for decades. Other partnerships will be far smaller, lower risk, community-led proposals to activate an underused asset or increase community access to an existing facility. The new policy aims to umbrella partnerships across that spectrum while ensuring that our processes are proportionate to the scale and risk. We want to apply greater rigour to larger projects while making sure that we're not putting unnecessary barriers in the way of smaller ones. We also intend to apply the treaty principles to guide any facility partnerships with Māori. We've also put more emphasis on proactive partnering, where the council goes out actively seeking partners when we know there is a network gap that we need to address. But the policy still provides a clear route for responding to partnership opportunities identified by the community, including at the local level. We've developed 4 investment principles to guide our decisions. These are investing strategically, so in ways that align with the outcomes that we've already set out in our strategies and plans, investing equitably in ways that target known gaps and address unmet needs, investing wisely, which means ensuring we're delivering the best possible value for public money, and investing sustainably, which means investing in viable facilities and partnerships that we're confident will last the distance. We've also placed a lot more emphasis on building and resourcing strong relationships with our partners and on valuing the commitment, resources and expertise that they bring to the table. We believe the new policy will support us to make better investment decisions, be a better partner to communities and deliver better outcomes for communities. So if I could just have the final slide, and I'll draw your attention quickly to the next steps for this policy if you give your endorsement today. So we'll be engaging with our current and potential partners and stakeholders across the community, arts and sports sectors for around 8 weeks over June, July and August. We'll be collating feedback from the local events and take this to local boards at their workshops in July and August and seek formal feedback at their business meetings in August and September. Depending on the feedback we receive, we should have a final policy back to this committee sometime around October or November 2018. So I'll stop there and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Excellent presentation. Thanks, Rebecca. Questions? Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thanks. I can't imagine the complexity around this, because even the patch that I know, there's literally hundreds of different partnership models. So how are you going to be sure you've actually got it right and you've got a one spot of truth?
So just to clarify the question, do you mean in relation to a specific proposal?
The partnerships, what do they look like? How do you know you've got it right? The quality of the asset, the partnership, you know.
So through you, Madam Chair, with this policy approach, what we're trying to do is ask a lot more questions earlier on and do a lot more analysis earlier on before anybody's making any agreements or signing on any dotted lines. There are often a lot of ways that these outcomes can be delivered. An asset won't always be one of them. Building a new asset won't always be the best value either. So what we're trying to do with this is a lot of the facility partnerships that we've had here in the past have focused very much on building new buildings on council land that are run by the community. And while that is a valid and often will be an excellent model, it's not the only model. So we've attempted to provide much more capability within the policy to look at a lot of other arrangements, many of which will be lower cost, lower risk, potentially shorter term. So what we're proposing to do is having a far more detailed conversations at the early stages to look at what some of those different options might be, and that there are decision gates all the way through. So to get through a decision gate, you've already had to have a good think about what some of those things might be, possibly look into some of those more closely before you get through into the next one. And one of the other reasons for that, Councillor, is to make sure that our partners aren't putting too much energy into things like feasibility studies well before we've actually established, is there a need, is, you know, what else is there in the network and so on. I don't know if that answers your question.
Half? So with existing partnerships, are you doing an audit on those as well?
So as I said earlier, there are 300 partnerships at least
Thought there'd be more than
already
that.
in Auckland. This policy is about how we enter new partnerships. However, many of those partnerships will arrive at a natural point of review or renewal at some point over the next several years. Some of them may even be annual. Our understanding is that we would potentially be looking at those in tranches over the next few years as they naturally come to a point to be looked at again, and taking them through this more rigorous process to make sure that if we are going to renew or extend or continue, that we've done a more thorough look than we did sometimes in the first time around. However, there's no way that all of those will be able to be considered at once. It's likely to be triaged to where we see there's particular value in applying this process earlier on, and that those would be the ones when they, as I say, come to a natural point of review.
That's going to be the challenging part, yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Cashmore. Good question. Councillor Walker.
Sure. So I've read the report, understand it, and I don't have any issues with it. Having said that, I'm assuming in terms of the engagement of this, that we're obviously going to engage fairly broadly with the general public, but quite obviously the targeted group are other facilities, and that is facilities that we don't own. I don't know whether we have any database of those facilities at this point. So I guess my question around this is really around the implementation of our engagement and the opportunity for people to engage less than once, so there's a template to actually capture information. Because particularly if we accept that some of these facilities are offering an outstanding service to the council and to Auckland, it would be useful to identify some of those earlier rather than later in your triage process. So my question is around how we find these locations. They cover recreation, sports, arts, cultural, maraes. There are even private libraries, halls, civic spaces, open space. It's very comprehensive. So that's my first question. How do we track these places down in terms of our engagement?
Through you, Madam Chair. So we have fairly substantial databases that are held by our colleagues in operations who have, you know, those funding agreements or relationships in place already. So we'll be contacting all of the facilities that we know about that we have some kind of funding arrangement with. But also there are some, as I say, in the pipeline where groups are approaching council, you know, on a monthly basis to talk about needs that they might have or proposals that they might have. So where we've already had some contact, we'll be aiming to invite those groups to participate as well. However, we will be putting out more general information to invite people to come and be part of the consultation through other networks that we have. For example, Active have a very, very large database of sports groups, not all of whom will currently be in facilities. So we'll be doing our best to circulate via those channels as well.
Okay, got that. So my question further to this is, are we going to be generating some kind of template for these entities to populate to save us a further step? Otherwise we're going to be going back and then back and then back and then back.
So just to clarify, you mean a template to provide feedback on the policy or something else?
Well, something that might generate some information. So for example, I can think of a rugby club that has their own building, has their own land. and they're providing effectively a facility that would otherwise be provided by council. So information around the nature of that, you identify charities as being a priority, so what's the nature of the organisation, corporate society, charity and the like, what's the nature of the asset, what's the information around the asset, what does it do in terms of benefit to council. I'm sure there's a bundle of things, and I'm assuming that that data is then going to inform the next step.
So through Madam Chair, there's a couple of things that you're talking about there. I mentioned in my introduction about having a proactive track, which we haven't had before. So in the past, we've tended to partner only when organisations have approached us with a proposal. Some of the legacy councils actually operated funding schemes that literally opened, people put in applications and they closed. We haven't tended to go out actively looking for partners in the past. So what we're proposing to do through the policy is where we have identified through our own planning that there is a gap in the network, there is under-provision, there's under-supply. One of the things that this provides an opportunity to do is for staff to actually look at who else is already in the community, who's providing what, might there be some additional capacity somewhere else, might there be another way that we could deliver the additional capacity the community needs rather than simply moving to try and build.
Understand
so in that context, if, for example, we were looking for capacity, that rugby club was in that area, they may well be something that would be identified through that process.
Okay, and the last question I've got goes to the apples with apples comparison that we're going to need later, and that's an examine of our own facilities. Because it may well be that in a number of instances the private provider, if we call them that, is actually providing better value than we are, but we can't actually make that measurement until we've assessed our proposition. So is this covering off our facilities?
Through Madam Chair, no, the scope of this work is very much for when we're partnering with third parties. It's not an assessment of our own facilities. It may well be that there are other mechanisms through our operational parts of the business that are looking at our performance of our individual facilities or performance of specific parts of the network, but this policy is very much about where we're going to be working with community.
However, perhaps, Madam Chair, I can just clarify another point about other policy work that we have. So, of course, things like the Community Facility Network Plan, the Sports Facility Investment Plan, look at provision more broadly. So when we're thinking about where we need community facilities anywhere across the region, we're always looking at who else is in the market, who else is out there. Does council need to be providing this if someone else is doing this equally well? So that is something we're considering across the board anyway with all of our provision policies.
Okay, the reason I ask this is, if I give you an example, we could have some youth centres. One might be on council land and council building. Another might be on council land but their building. Another one might be on neither of those. And the only way that we're actually going to measure apples with apples is by taking into account what is on our land, and we're putting a value on that, and our building relative to the others. So there's a little bit more to it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is really important, Councillor. These are the other bits of work
I've read
that are happening.
that, sure.
This is where, if we say there's a gap, how do we actually make the partnership work?
And through you, Madam Chair, often when we're doing community assessments, you know, in a community, what is required, we're looking at the broad spectrum of what's available, what council provides, what others provide. So it's that full picture. So, because what is the actual need? If there's actually lots of other providers providing stuff, we may not need to intervene. We may be better supporting what exists already, either through a partnership, through a grant, through a community lease. There's a range of mechanisms. The Facility Partnerships Policy is one of those mechanisms.
And I guess just one last question, Madam Chair. I'm making the assumption that we don't have the provision for any additional funding for this in our long-term plan. And when I say funding, I mean supporting this whole variety of benefactors to our city.
So there is, as you know, through the long-term plan process, Council had considered the proposal for a sports investment fund. So I guess subject to your approval of that, that is one route for partnerships to go through. And in addition, local boards have local discretionary funds that they can make available to partner with local community organisations on facility partnerships as well. And in terms of council proactively partnering, of course, if we, you know, with the example of the investment that's proposed for FO, we may well go out and seek a proactive partnership for that, which might help reduce council's investment. So I think there's a range of ways that we can secure funding where we identify appropriate partnerships.
Okay, thank you, Councillor.
Thanks.
I've got Councillor Casey, Member Brown and Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Casey.
This is good work, Rebecca. I was particularly interested in the ethical considerations that are quite strong in here, in particular the human rights legislation compliance, given the recent case in Wellington where a trans woman was refused entry unless she was to provide a certificate of gender reassignment. I would hope that that would never, because of this strong wording in here. But what I thought was missing, and I'd like to discuss, is we have very clear guidelines in our Auckland plan about reducing the harm from gambling. And I know that some of the feedback you got was about pokies, and I don't see that mentioned in here. So where you say we won't invest in facilities that serve political purposes, why don't we say we won't invest in facilities that promote gambling or promote pokies?
So through you, Madam Chair, you're right that at the moment we don't make a clear statement to that effect. There's no reason why we couldn't make a clear statement to that effect. I suppose we would expect that, as we say, we would apply the same standards to these as we would apply to our own facilities. My understanding is our own community facilities aren't supported through gambling, but we haven't made a specific statement to that effect. It will be interesting when we go out for consultation and engagement whether that's actually something that is raised and that people feel we want to take a stronger position on that, but also happy to take that feedback from you, Councillor.
There's just another couple of things along the same lines. One is we remove sugary drinks from our facilities. In fact, that was Stephen Town's idea. And that's in that same bucket. Also letting facilities out to warmongers to put in their guns and cannons and so on. That's something that some local boards have passed resolutions about. This council hasn't, but local boards have. So are we just going to wait for that to come up in the feedback? Or do we not make a statement about our sinking lid policy on pokies?
I mean, this is probably where we need to also think about our wider provision model and policies. So obviously, everything we do should be within the law, so whatever's enabled through legislation. So that's why the human rights thing is so important within what we're doing. In terms of the investment models for sustainable community organisations, I mean, a lot of sports clubs do rely on different alternative income streams, including pokie machines. So I guess it goes to that question of how do we sustainably invest in, some aspects of the sport sector and other community organisations. So I don't know that we have a clear answer for you on that, Councillor Casey, but we can certainly go away and talk with our colleagues in other parts of the policy, community social policy area to discuss that and think about it and how we might respond when we come back with the final policy.
I think weaving that into some of the conversation for consultation is useful, but looking at where it's picked up in other policies. Member Brown.
Kia ora. Firstly, can I just acknowledge the depth that you've put into the report, in particular the torch you've shone on the Māori engagement that you've experienced so far. A couple of things from me. So can I have clarity over the Ngāti Pawa Point England bullet point on page 167, sorry? So you had a bullet point there that's sort of saying that there's a marae in Point England and has Ngāti Pawa's name beside it, and you've included that as part of your research spectrum. So could you explain that to me, please?
Sure. So apologies that wasn't actually made clearer in the report. One of the criteria in terms of selecting a range of marae to speak to was we wanted to look at some marae that were not yet built, but where there were conversations happening around whether they may in fact build, and therefore may be looking to partner with council around use of our land or support for the development of the marae. There are actually several live projects, I suppose you could say, where different iwi around Auckland and also some Mata Waka marae are actually looking at establishing new facilities. So the one at Ngāti Pawa was suggested to us as a good example of where they're at a very early stage, but you're correct that there is actually yet no marae building at the property at the moment. So apologies that wasn't clear.
Oh, no, I wasn't seeking, I just wanted that clarity. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
May I say, though, that, we're all wanting to build multiple marae somewhere timely in the future. Last but not least, does the policy, or will it, address and serve to discuss, and I'm picking on your opening comment in point 2 where council intends to meet more facility needs, doing more with less. So I'd like to reverse that and do less with more. Insofar as, will things like rate rebate for marae that subscribe to this policy be included in the policy?
So just to clarify the question, your meaning is using a rates rebate as one of the mechanisms that might support a partnership, is
Yep.
that right? So one of the things that we have done through this policy is identify that there's a range of different mechanisms at the moment through which council invests, and some of them are almost effectively invisible. That includes use of land, it includes any kinds of remissions or rebates that effectively aren't appearing on our balance sheet. We're foregoing revenue rather than receiving it. My understanding is there has been some work recently done around rates rebates for community and Māori land. I can't speak to the specifics of exactly where that's up to at the moment, but what we will be looking at when we've got a specific proposal in front of us is all of the different mechanisms we might use to invest. That may include things like use of land or foregoing revenue through fees or technical advice, possibly rates rebates, and that all of those things could be on the table when council's looking at the package of support it might provide. However, if there is moves in other parts of council to change the policy around rates rebates and how those are applied, this policy would align with that. It wouldn't be the other way around. So if there is any move to change eligibility around rates rebates that's a blanket rule, this policy would have to fall into line behind that. But as I say, one of the things we're trying to get people to think about is the grants are only one part of the picture. There's lots of different ways the council can invest, and not all of them will be monetary or will not all be in the form of actually making an allocation. It may be actually foregoing revenue. So apologies, that's a kind of a long-winded answer, but...
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Last but not least, just how, for marae that are based in coastal environments that are exposed to climate change and sea level rise, will the policy,
And
well,
there's a few of those.
if you've engaged in an audience of Māori and they want to discuss with you in this policy draft, do you have the appetite to consider that within the policy? Is your answer yes?
So just to clarify again, you're saying that if a marae wanted to develop on an exposed coastal site,
Well,
that
no,
was...
they already sit in
They
an
already
exposed site,
Right.
and they inevitably are going to have to move. So, you know, when I think about the partnership policy of the facility, how long in this partnership are you? Are you just in it while they survive, and then when they get swamped, you need a new partnership policy? Or does the existing one support growth into the future, accommodating climate change?
Yes, so I think the answer would be yes.
Thank you.
I mean, the fact is we have obviously, there's always going to be a lot of calls on the limited resources that we have, but people will be bringing to us their situation, their circumstances, and telling us about the needs they currently fulfil for their community. If people are losing their facilities through the likes of climate change, I think that would make a very strong case for the urgency of that to be addressed. However, of course, that would be a conversation at the time.
Last but not least, just a throwaway comment, sorry Madam Chair, but I am Ngāti Pāwa. We do have marae, that's not in Point England, and I really feel for Te Kawerau Āmaki, given that they're later on our agenda. We're also considering an emerging marae. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you.
Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, Madam Chair, I'm really excited because I've really wanted to see this paper come before us, and along with the investments workshop later on today, those who've sat around the table will know since 2010 it was a matter of great grievance with me that the partnerships policy was not rolled over in 2010. But when I read through it very carefully last night, I was just so impressed with the level of detail that you've actually put into it and the various scenarios that you've given consideration to. And I just want to, in speaking to it, to say, obviously, this is just for consultation. There will be issues, and you've heard matters being raised today. But I think wherever you sit on the political spectrum, you have to understand that the future is about partnerships. Absolutely. And that we are going to have to really optimise our land, our investments, And I love the theme of sustainability that you've actually woven into this throughout. So, Rebecca, you've presented it with great enthusiasm, and Denise, I know the passion that you've had in terms of seeing this. So, Madam Chair, I'm happy to second or move. I'm very excited about this. This is one of the really positive days in this term of council for me, seeing this body of work come forward.
Thank you, Councillor.
And the issue that you raise actually in the agenda is the risk of perhaps raising expectations before we're quite ready, and it might be good if you could just give us a little bit more of an explanation as to how you might do that. And secondly, I'm hoping that as we did the sustainability of sports, we travelled around the region. Is it the intention to travel around the region and hear from organisations firsthand rather than expecting everyone to come in here?
Through you, Madam Chair. So the first question was around how we're going to manage those risks around raising expectations. I think that is a real risk, and one of the reasons it's a risk is because whatever we might say about what the scope of the work is and who it's going to impact and who it isn't, people may still make the assumption that either there's money available when there isn't, or that it will affect their arrangement when it won't. But we will certainly be doing our best to make very clear that this is about future partnerships, the mechanisms through which those can be funded, and the process, and when actually, assuming this is adopted around the end of the year, when that might start to take effect. We will also, as I say, be inviting current partners to these events, so we will be very clear in those invitations to spell out what that might mean in terms of if they've got partnerships that are coming up for review, or if they haven't. This policy is very much about a future approach. When we do our events, and we are going to be doing several around the region, we will be starting off with a fairly short briefing just to kind of introduce what's in the room, and we will be at pains again then to point out what it covers and what it doesn't, and inviting people, if they've got any questions in that regard, to come and speak to us personally. We will be running these events as walkthroughs rather than a presentation up on a board and then people kind of going away again afterwards. Some of you may have come to earlier walkthroughs that we've done where we've actually had the material printed very large, AO size, up on the wall. It's very easy to navigate. People can kind of take their time, and we will have staff on hand to answer questions. As I say, we will do a brief introduction at the start, but we will be providing people with the time they need to read in as much or a little detail as they would like. We're going to be doing events in 6 locations, including South-South and North-North, so Warkworth and down in Pukekohe as well, and also in 4 other locations around Auckland. Our plan is also to invite 2 of the marae who participated in the work with us to host 2 further hui for us to engage with Māori around the findings report, but also around what they make of the policy approach. So at the very least, there's likely to be around 8 events. We also anticipate having some more targeted conversations with some of our key stakeholders, the likes of Foundation North or other key funders in this space, to be able to talk with them about where they see themselves fitting into this and how how those conversations might go forward. So again, all we can do is put out there the best we can, what it covers, what it doesn't, what the time frame's likely to be, and emphasise that wherever we've got a chance.
Well, Madam Chair, I think this is a great body of work. I think it should go up for consultation, and I particularly like the explanation around commercial, not investing in commercial, but with those caveats around it, because for the future, we do need our voluntary organisations to actually adopt some measure of commercial activity to fund the ongoing OPEX. But you've expressed it beautifully. I love the visuals. I think it's a really, really good piece of communication, so I'm very happy to move it.
Oh,
Thank you,
fantastic, Councillor Fletcher. Thank you. Councillor Filipaina, do you want a second? Because you're the next, the last speaker.
Yeah, no problems at all. Thank you.
Oh, and you're
Is questions and comment?
the both.
Both.
Because you are, I think, the last speaker.
Councillor Hills.
Oh, Councillor
Yeah.
Hills.
So look, question first, and it's on. It's on page 101. It's greater focus on. That's the and you've got allocated lead relationship broker.
Oh, yes.
So, are we looking at the local board brokers that we currently have there? Because I agree with it. So, that's the question.
So through you, Madam Chair, no, not necessarily. The thing is that those strategic brokers already have full-time roles doing what they do. Sometimes they are a front door for organisations to come through in the first instance and raise these sorts of ideas with us. However, in some cases, these may cross more than one local board. They may be requiring more specialist or technical support and advice at different stages. So let's say, for example, it's a major sports facility. It may make more sense for that lead relationship broker to be someone sitting in the sport and recreation team. If it is a regional arts facility, it might be that there's someone in the regional arts team who would be more appropriate to hold that relationship. However, in some cases, and I would anticipate particularly where they are smaller, perhaps shorter, quicker sorts of partnerships where someone maybe wants to use a disused building just for a year, or they just want to try something out, I would anticipate the strategic brokers would quite likely be the best person to hold those relationships. But we aren't making any assumptions about who those people are, and it will come down to you know, what's where, who's the best person for the job. But it's really about the principle of saying, we heard very clearly during our first phase of work that most people didn't have a clear relationship holder, or sometimes that person would leave the organisation and they'd be left not knowing who that person was that they could go to if they needed help to navigate council. So really we're making a principal commitment to say that somebody will be named, will hold that responsibility, and will, even if that person has to change, that will be properly handed over so somebody can pick up those responsibilities.
So supplementary, Rebecca, to what
Sure.
you've just said, is it going to be in-house, or are we going to end up employing somebody from the outside?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm assuming it would be in-house. It's too soon for me to say, but that would certainly be something probably left to the operational arms of council. If they find they don't have the capacity, then that might be something they'd put forward. But at this stage, it's very much, we anticipate this is something that our existing staff would do.
My worry with it is around so many of the facilities that we will have partnerships with, and so many people we may end up employing. That's only a concern that needs to be noted, because where's the money coming from? So just need to sort of table that. Just speaking to the item, page 123, and you've got scale there. I like that particular section because you've noted we won't overburden simple, low-risk partnerships, etc. I think that's an asset. And I know that when you go through further on past that particular point on the attachment, you've also got a scale in regards to how much the partnerships could mean around any monies that council. And my last point is in investing in, well, having equity anyway, and that's on page 130, and that's principle 2. I think that work is going to be crucial, because it'll give at least an outline from a regional perspective as to where the shortfalls are. And yeah, so look, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is very comprehensive, and there's a lot of good stuff in here, and it's going up for consultation, obviously. But my kind of question, so the setting up the partnerships and rolling them over is great, and I know we've come a long way since maybe 6 or 7 years ago, but I think sometimes, especially on the shore, when most of the community facilities are partnerships already, sometimes I think, are we able to look forward on how the accountability, so sometimes we make largely volunteers or lower paid staff kind of do reporting and programming stuff like every month, whole lot of time, when often maybe we're giving them 40 grand and their overall, maybe 10% or a third at the most of their overall budget, because they're getting funding from everywhere else, and we kind of make them do all this work which might take them away from the community. That's one thing. And the other thing is that sometimes it's just the support. So obviously it's hugely beneficial to council. We don't have to fund a whole centre and all the staff, but sometimes we just don't give them maybe the level of expertise they might need around financial help, governance. You know, sometimes a really good community outcome, if they don't have the people volunteering, sometimes the organisations can fall over or have trouble. So is that part of the thinking? Like, obviously the initial partnership is great, but the long-term kind of pressure we put on them as the council machine. Do you have any thoughts on that, or is it?
Yes, so through you, Madam Chair, absolutely. What you've just described is a story that became very familiar to us through that first phase of work. So absolutely the proportionality approach is about picking up on that. So where the money is actually, you know, not a lot, people have shown themselves to be capable in the past, then actually we would be expecting staff to say, what is the right level of reporting to ensure that, you know, we're doing our due diligence around the use of public funds, but we're also making sure that these are not unnecessarily onerous. But speaking to the second point, I think one of the key things we're trying to get, and it comes also back to Councillor Walker's point earlier, that we need to be asking questions a lot earlier about what it's actually going to mean to support these relationships over the long term. What has happened sometimes in the past is the focus has all been about getting the money together for the building, and then once the building is built, you know, we've moved on to the next project in our pipeline, and there's not been a discussion or an expectation, certainly on our side, about an ongoing support arrangement. So we will be, particularly where the partners are lower capacity, lower capability, actually costing in, if we do think there is support that may be useful to them, that's actually costed as part of the proposal when it goes up. Again, as we mentioned with Councillor Filipaina, that somebody is actually nominated to hold that, to be alert to opportunities where actually perhaps some governance training at this point might be something that's going to, you know, pay dividends. And that as I say, we look to cost those in very early on. But at the same time, we haven't wanted partners that are lower capability to necessarily be ruled out of hand. It's just about understanding that their support needs may be higher, and that's something that needs to be factored in.
Cool, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Perfect.
thank you.
But it's really good. Otherwise.
Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry, I just got one.
very quickly,
Yeah,
Councillor.
it is, and it's really on, again, the lead relationship broker that I mentioned. Rebecca, your comment was that it could be outside, but we've, on attachment B on page 130, we've actually said that it'll be within the council. So isn't it better just to have lead relationship broker in the event that we end up hiring people? I mean, I'm looking at the budget, I'm looking at, you know, people that may be employed. For me, it just leaves it open.
Can we pick that up as part of the
Yeah,
consultation, Councillor?
is that okay? Because I think it's just, it's important we leave it open,
Yeah.
because we've tied ourselves to within the council, which you've made the comment on. That's
Okay.
all.
Thank you.
And one broker can hold like a whole bunch of balloons, they can hold a whole bunch
Right.
of community
It's
partnerships.
just what Rebecca said earlier about possibly employing it from
Okay.
outside.
I'm going to put that recommendation. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. And Rebecca, please take the
Good work.
words by Councillor Fletcher to heart. It's a fantastic report.
Yeah, well done.
Right,
Thank you. Well
Liz,
It's
we've
a
still
lot of
got
work.
you though.
You've
Could
got me
keep
for
you
another 2
involved
items.
for years,
That's the one thing. Thank you,
literally.
councillors.
Right.
So, councillors,
Who's joining you, Liz?
I'd like to introduce Ben Brooks and Tina Abiad from my team, who are going to talk you through the Investing in Aucklanders work.
Wonderful.
Over to you, Ben.
Okay, thank you.
I think we may have a presentation, Tam.
Yes.
Just 3 slides.
Thank you, councillors. Yes, another, hopefully a very quick presentation. We've just got a few slides. I'm going to talk very briefly on the context and where this work has come from, and then I'll hand over to Tina, who's been leading all the work, to talk about the findings and the decision we're seeking from you in terms of next steps. So, Auckland Plan, obviously, have just been signed off, sets the strategic context for this bit of work. This primarily relates to the belonging and participation outcome, but also links to homes and places and opportunity and prosperity. You'll hear in the next item a bit more about the Thriving Communities Strategic Action Plan, which is the overarching piece of work underneath this, and then Investing in Aucklanders, which you'll hear some more details on in a moment, sits underneath that as sort of where the rubber hits the road. So this bit of work came from a Regional Strategy and Policy Committee in 2016, where you asked us to go away and look at how to become a friendly and inclusive city for all Aucklanders. As part of that, we've gone out and talked to quite a diverse range of Aucklanders, over 650 people at 37 workshops, with a particular focus on people that don't traditionally engage with the council. As part of that, we ran a combined panel session, which I know some councillors attended, to remind you about that. And I'll just hand over to Tina to talk about what we found through that session.
Okay. Good afternoon, councillors. Before we can embark on finding out what we can do to make Auckland more inclusive, it's really important that we actually hear the voice of Aucklanders. And this piece of community engagement was set up for that particular purpose. we wanted to take a bit of time to understand what inclusion means to people. And so we went through this engagement process, and we heard and learned from Aucklanders about their actual lived experiences of inclusion and belonging, along with the enablers and the barriers to this. And we got a good picture and a pretty good steer on what an inclusive Auckland might look like. This work has given us some insights into what inclusion means to people, and a lot of that work is detailed in the findings report that's attached as attachment 1. We wanted to find out from lots of diverse perspectives, and from many that don't, as Ben mentioned, don't usually engage with us. And around about 80% of the people that filled in their evaluation form from those 650 people, about 80% of them said they'd only engaged with council maybe once, but never before. So that was very pleasing that we managed to find and hear some voices that we haven't heard before. The findings really present the human face of what is important to Aucklanders. And we found that what catalysed their feelings of sense of belonging were told through stories. And the triggers for those stories were acts of kindness that were given to people totally unsolicited, and this was particularly relevant for new settlers and quite symbolic. Also, events and whānau gatherings and family events are the things that help people feel that they belong. So once we'd heard these stories from our Aucklanders, we asked them to unpick what the elements of inclusion are. And you will find that in the key findings report, and there are some key characteristics of inclusion that come through there. And Aucklanders, as a collective, across all of these engagement, we saw coming through quite strongly were values of care, concern, and curiosity and sharing. And also that, that people were really, really very strongly advocating that the thing that is holding Auckland back in terms of inclusion is inequality. And that came through every single engagement that we did. In many ways, these findings reinforce and validate a lot of what counselling enabling activities already are, like community spaces, places, programs, events, and the way we run and deliver our democracy. And also our agenda relating to housing and transport. Housing, transport and safety came through really strongly as a key essentials and bedrocks for inclusion. So before we can go into cohesion and unity and a sense of belonging and us being who we are and being able to be who we are, we need to actually get the bedrocks right. And I think some of that feedback is coming through quite strongly through the Auckland Plan. Although we're on the right track, and a lot of the things that when people envisaged what an inclusive Auckland might look like, we didn't ask them to identify council's role. We did ask them to tell us what the barriers to inclusion are, what are the things that they like that think that we're already providing that help inclusion and enable inclusion, and what are the things that we could think about as a whole city, not just a council, to improve and to create new. And a lot of the barriers and the opportunities for facilitating more inclusion are already sitting within a lot of our existing roles. And but the key barriers that really stood out were around inequality, discrimination, and feeling unsafe. And that the community was saying that we need to do things better, to do things in a way that enables more inclusion. And we also heard that we have to continue to work really hard in living well together, given our diversity and our growing population and our changing lifestyles. So this work provides us with a solid base and an opportunity to do some piloting of what we could do to increase inclusion. And that previous slide was really just a snippet of people's actual quotes of what the everyday things that they experience that are barriers and are enablers, and they're direct quotes from people in the engagements. So Aucklanders were saying that they want to They want to move inclusion to be more of an everyday experience. And council has a lot of influence. It holds a leadership role along with some other levers that could help to set the tone and intent around city inclusion. So we're proposing that we run a series of low-risk, low-cost pilots to test what works in quick learning loops. So we've learned a lot of stuff from this big engagement, and we'd really like to go out and test a few things. Not necessarily big long-term pilots that cost lots of money, but going out there and really finding out from the community what really makes a difference and what things could we do, not only to adjust and tweak some of our own services, but also looking at what might come through that could be new, that could be possibly scaled. So our approach would include collaborating with partners, collaborating with community and working with those most in need, and making the most of our existing resources and the resources of others, such as tailoring and adding value. We're also socialising this work to find out what others are already doing across the organisation and probably with central government and some other players across the city, to see whether they might be able to do two things. A, apply an inclusion lens over their work and use the work and evidence that we have, and also to look at whether there's some more potential pilots and working together. And an example of that is service integration and transport. So a possible example pilot could be, we do know that social isolation and loneliness, there's lots of evidence that that is a really big barrier for seniors and young people, and there could be an opportunity to dig into something around social isolation and connectedness and inclusiveness for seniors. That could be an example of a possible pilot. And we do have some potential partners in the wings that might be able to help us do that.
Okay, I think that's, you've heard quite a lot from Tina about what that work is involved, and we are now very happy to take questions.
Can we just, and I think this is always hard being the first or second gig after lunch, the bit that's still just not clear to me, and I don't know if other members are feeling the same, is just what is our next kind of step in thinking about the pilots? What is the practical process around
So
that?
probably the first practical step, we'll be talking with our own business units. So talking with parts of council about what those opportunities for where we might be able to tailor our services, do things a bit differently to help break down some of those barriers or kind of enhance the enablers. There are some things that we're aware of that are happening in the community that we could potentially partner with as well. So it's kind of a coalition of the willing, finding out where we've got existing resources and opportunity and working there first and foremost. But focusing on those areas of need with target populations that we know are facing barriers, and working closely with our panels. So we'd envisage working with our advisory panels closely on those next steps as well.
Okay, no, that's really useful. Thanks, Naz. Councillor Walker.
Sure. I mean, this is really good stuff. Not knocking it at all. Having said that, in terms of inclusion and you know, focusing on people, things that people want, and empathy and the like, there are instances, particularly through engagement that council's doing and CCO's doing, where people feel really left out, feel not listened to. I've attended meetings numbering some hundreds of people where that feeling has been unanimous. Obviously, we've got sell down of civic assets. There's substantial dissatisfaction across parts of Auckland, and I can appreciate that this is a good step to addressing that, but how does that fit, and how are we evaluating that in terms of inclusiveness and empathy and so on?
Look, I think the council recognises there's an ongoing challenge around democracy and how people participate, and that's a key element of inclusion, is feeling that you have a ability to have your say and how your community, how your society, how your city works. So, you know, our comms and engagement teams are looking at that closely, They're doing a whole range of things around voter participation, opportunities for people to have their say. So in all of the work that particularly community and social policy do, we're looking at how do we ensure that the voices of community come through. So this particular piece of work was looking specifically at how we can encourage and facilitate greater a sense of inclusion on a whole range of levels, but particularly focusing where we might, where those areas of most of need. And utilising our existing resources to do that, and our existing levers.
Okay, I guess the concern that I'd put is when you look at this sort of thing in an organisation, quite often you're talking about a cultural shift, and that's set from the top in terms of no surprises, inclusiveness and the like, and we may have some issues there. So I just raise that, and I think some of those issues are self-evident to many Aucklanders, and maybe to councillors.
And I guess we're responsible for that too. Sometimes the community, we're not going to please them all. It's how we tell them news that they aren't going to like in a sensitive, inclusive and empathetic way, rather than just leaving them out of the conversation. So, you know, we've all got our part to play. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions from me. I'm still trying to land the problem definition here, let alone the solution. So we start the pilot, you're talking about the social isolation for the elderly. I kind of feel that that space is already pretty well populated with Age Concern and with other agencies in the community that have, to me, a lot more sort of skin in the game, and we could be learning from them rather than going out and doing a pilot ourselves. They do a lot of work in terms of addressing social isolation, in terms of connectiveness. That's the reason for Gold Card, Total Mobility Scheme. There's a whole sort of suite of stuff that's already done in that space. So what is your additional offering? What are you doing that's new that isn't already being done? That's my first question.
So, Councillor Newman, you raise a very good point. So there are a lot of agencies in this space, and I guess it would be council looking at what we have to bring to the table. So we do have some levers. We provide spaces and places where people connect and meet, and we see that as an important role for council to play. So how could we mobilise our resources, so our community facilities, our parks, our community services, in a way that supports more social connection for older people? So that's, I guess, the opportunity. And we might well, in the case of socialisation for seniors, partner with others who are doing that. So it's not that we would replace services that others are providing, but how can we leverage what we do to make sure that we're kind of creating the best possible opportunities for older people.
Could you sort of articulate to me how our relationship with Age Concern Kāris Manukau, which is my age concern where I am, what would we do differently than what we currently do with them? I mean, this is just...
Yep. Oh, through you, Madam Chair. Recently, the Puketi Papa, a board member from Puketi Papa, Anne-Marie Caudry, and myself were lucky enough to go on a co-design process on social connectedness of seniors. And that co-design process involved lots of agencies around the table, and also academic institutions as well, and Ministry of Health, for instance. And they were looking specifically around seniors' social isolation and connectedness, because despite the fact that there's a lot of activity out there, it's still not making enough difference. And they came up, this Innovate Change, which is the co-design company, came up with about 5 or 6 insights that will make a difference for seniors. And there could be an opportunity for further work in that space. And one of those areas is around social connections for seniors.
Okay, others might have questions.
I think I can see people a little bit like, you know, there is a little bit of thinking to go on in here. That's why I asked the question about the next steps. And I think rather than us worry, you know, are we going to be inventing another whole layer of stuff? I think what we're doing is saying, we've heard from our community, they don't always feel involved. You know, Councillor Walker made it quite clear, and sometimes they feel quite alienated. We keep talking around this table about how we deal to that. This is our process. So if we simply start with our offering, what are we doing to make it easier to help with social isolation. What are we doing to make it easier for people to see faces and languages that are different? What are we doing to make sure that we are being as utterly inclusive as we can? That feels like a very good start. The pilots might be small baby steps, and it's simply about how we do things differently. It'll come back to this committee for a further discussion. So I think let's, we don't need to boil the ocean about what it would look like. Some of it is saying, and we've all taken turns around this table to say it, we need to be more empathetic, open to and inclusive of our community, and this is just our putting words into action. I don't think that's a bad thing.
Through you, Madam Chair, just one final point of clarification, because sometimes, mostly what council does is universal service provision, and sometimes it's just about doing a little bit of tailoring. That means something that didn't feel that welcoming to a certain part of the community suddenly opens its doors in a much more inclusive way. So sometimes it can be, looking at those opportunities. How can we tailor this service, this activity that we do in a way that will open doors to more people?
Okay. All right. Councillor Fletcher. Well, Councillor Fletcher, then Councillor Watson.
Well, Madam Chair, I mean, Liz is good to give us that clarity around it. The comparison I'd make between this and the last paper is the last paper really identified much more clearly risks. And the risk for me, as someone who's been involved with a lot of voluntary organisations, is that we end up duplicating things that voluntary organisations are already doing, and where we know they are not supported sufficiently now. Yeah. And we know that they're underfunded now. Now this, yes, you're limiting it to some sort of just a few case studies on it, but it runs the risk for me of becoming bigger than Ben-Hur. I'm all for a sense of belonging, but I'm also all for supporting the existing voluntary organisations we've got. So Liz, what did you, as a senior officer, identify by way of risks when you signed off this paper?
And I suppose that is why we're proposing the pilot method. So it is about trialling some things, testing in quick learning loops, so you're not making big investments, and you're absolutely leveraging council's existing investment. We're already investing a lot in community services in a whole range of ways. So this is about how do we do that better in some cases. So to me, the risk is that we don't do that, and therefore our services essentially not being as inclusive as they could be. I think what we're saying also is that we do see this as not reinventing what somebody else is doing, but opportunities to partner better with people who are in the community. A key learning in this paper was around the role of community connectors. Those are those people in the community that are the glue. They're the people that kind of connect people across and within communities. How can we support them? That could be a potential piece of further examination, because we've heard from those people that actually they really struggle. And in the paper, there's a whole section around the barriers that those community connectors feel in terms of being able to do what they're really good at. They are good at connecting people within communities and across communities. And how can we support them to do that better? What would that look like? So, look, I absolutely hear what you're saying, Councillor Fletcher. We're certainly not trying to duplicate or replicate what the community does so well. It's kind of an and, if you like.
I accept that it's complementary, but I've also got some reservations that I haven't been able to get rid of today.
Can I just, before I go to Councillor Watson, the part of this was we talked about being an age-friendly city, we've talked about being a inclusive city, we've talked about all of these things that we can sign up to, and my understanding and recollection is that Council has said no, we'd rather staff go away and have a look at a more holistic and inclusive approach, and this is actually what you've brought back to us. So we at some stage need to go, we can't keep going back to the drawing board. At some stage we're going to have to, what is it, crouch, touch and engage or whatever, and actually kind of get down with our communities and go, what are we hearing, what's not working, where are those barriers, where is it where people are feeling invisible, where are they feeling isolated, where are they feeling unheard in this big monster of an organisation we are, and how do we break down those barriers, be inclusive, friendly and allow for thriving communities. I think there's a lot of words around this, but I think that's the essence of what this is, and you're asking for our endorsement to say let's go and have a crack around the big organisation that is council and breaking through some of those barriers. Is that kind of it in a nutshell?
Absolutely. And if we find that things that work, then we would come back and say, could we look at replicating, scaling up if we think things really work?
Yeah. Friendly face of council, there'd be a scary idea. Councillor Watson, then Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, no, I'd just like to say I really like what I'm hearing here, and I really congratulate you guys. You've got to start somewhere, and it sounds to me as you're ready to start, and that's encouraging. I mean, if you look at the statistics in New Zealand for this sort of thing, they're woeful. We have the worst youth suicide rate in the developed world. We have one of the worst rates of bullying. It's not just old people feeling isolated. One of the real eye-openers to me the last little while in my own community is the jaw-dropping state of some of our youth. And what you're saying here, I can immediately boom for. I can see straight away where the council could make its leisure centre available to the people that are working with some of these youth, maybe free or when it's whatever. So a very practical thing that wouldn't cost anyone anything but would really help them. So we need to make a start. It's all very well having, rolling out a big transport package and all the rest of it. What price that if our youth are killing themselves in record numbers and all those other terrible statistics. So good on you guys, and boy, you've got a good place to start with this Auckland Council, because we could be leading the way a lot more than we do in a number of ways. So I'm happy to move this, Madam Chair.
I'll quickly jump in and second it, because I think you and I might be slightly alone on this one, Councillor Watson. Exactly. This is all about opportunity. Thank you. Sorry, I don't mean to get carried away in the chair. I'll now take a deep breath and calm down. Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks. Very quick question. So there's 5 sort of startups you're looking to do. Will you be going to the local boards to say what can you do? What's the big gap in your area? 'Cause I know in my area there was nothing for youth, there was nothing for old people, there was no place for them to go and talk. A liquor paint, a bit of new furniture, an internet connection supplied by this council and a guy called Jez.
Hello.
That's his name. 3 months it was done. It revolutionised Little Rural Village. It's soon become a town of 2,000 people, but it changed it. And that's the sort of thing that local boards intuitively know. I don't think it needs to be a huge academic exercise. It just needs to be charged through into like some product management rather than more computer tapping.
We don't need to boil the ocean over this one.
Exactly.
Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to join the chorus around the work that has been done. And I remember at the first meeting of the Auckland Council, there was a group that we ended up talking to, and that was the crime prevention group. We ended up getting them all together, had our Pacifica one, Māori, we had WaterSafe, and basically they were just a feeding block for us, around what was happening out in the region, the districts. So, whatever we end up using, as long, and I know this will happen, is that there's no duplication. That's the whole thing. There's no duplication. I look forward, and the Chair mentioned this earlier, I look forward to the piece of work coming back and saying, hey, look, yeah, there may be an opportunity to kickstart some of the stuff we had. We had the accreditation that we ended up going through with the World Health Organization around our crime prevention, and I remember that discussion way back in 2011. So, I just look forward to more work coming back to us around what we can do to achieve what you've got in here. So, kia ora.
Kia ora, Councillor. And Councillor Hills, then Will.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, overall I support the intent. We've got really good direction here, especially around inclusion and acceptance and making sure our services are outwardly facing to all people, no matter their age, ethnicity, sexuality, gender. I do have concerns sort of similar to Councillor Fletcher, that I don't want to see it as we become the doer, because we know that annoys our community organisations when they feel like they're struggling along, and then we kind of jump in and go, hey, we're going to do this because you need us. rather than just going, here's an extra $5,000 or $10,000 to get you across the line. This might just my, or did you want?
No,
Oh,
was there a question or?
No, it's just my speaking turn, really. But I do like the barriers and enablers suggestion, but I hope we're just removing the barriers and enabling others. Because I know the empowerment unit, although does lots of great work, sometimes groups will still say, it feels like you're not empowering us to do it and get on. And it's things like placemaking, it's things like just council getting out of the way, really.
Very good.
So I'm happy with the direction, the words, but I think it's more about, and like other councillors have said, it's more about making sure we are allowing this to happen. We are good-facing. You know, there was an announcement yesterday about, oh yeah, we're going to maybe charge $500 for people evading fears. Yeah, that sounds great. We don't want anyone to evade fears. But what does that look like on the ground? Are we targeting young people? Are we targeting certain ethnicities? Are we checking everyone who walks through that door? And what is that if that person accidentally misses it? A young person jumps on and forgets to do hop. Should we really be celebrating when we can't get the police to sort out the red light cameras, which is actually a life or death thing, rather than losing $3.30 when someone jumps on a train? So, so I totally get this, but it needs to be right across. I feel we've jumped huge hoops since I started as an elected member. Look at the advisory panels, things like that. Actually look at the Auckland plan and how much it changed. Fantastic. People overwhelmingly support those aims. But when we look on the street, sometimes these words aren't coming through. Are we making sure that people don't, in our libraries, don't look down at our young people who are sitting on the computer because they don't have a computer at home? Whatever those things are, I think we've got to make sure all our rules and regulations and policies are inclusive, because I don't want to see us trying to replicate the community's role. I want us to be more like the community, which I think we are in 89, 90% of ways. And I think this is really good, but I just don't want to, there's a line that we cross, and I don't want to do that. But we need to talk the talk in every area, and I think, although we've come a long way, there's still a long way to go. But this is good.
And Councillor, I think you've given the perfect example of where this can fit. What is Auckland Transport doing so that young people feel included and safe on public transport? End of story. Cool. I'm going to put the recommendation. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried.